When the apartheid state becomes a free state, which it will, when historians and reporters analyze the turning of the tide in that country, South Africa now will surely be noted as a force that helped foment that change.
Ladies and gentlemen, the force behind that force, Ms. Carolyn Craven.
South Africa now congratulates anchor Carolyn Craven, who has received the Candace Award from the National Coalition of 100 Black Women. Global Vision presents the television news magazine of Southern Africa.
It doesn't exist on television, and it doesn't exist.
I would actually appeal to the world that information is there and can be found.
Because it is important that people know what is happening.
This week, South Africa Now presents these stories. Peace breaks out in Angola. Africans negotiate a ceasefire to end the fighting between Angola's government and Jonas Savimbi's UNITA.
There is nothing international about the problem in Angola. It's a purely African problem, and it's a purely Angolan internal affairs. And only their African brothers and sisters could understand and could help them. And this is what happened in Zaire.
With the world outraged by the execution of activists in China, South Africa sentences 14 dissidents to die on the gallows.
It is the apartheid regime that is hanging, and not the people of South Africa that are doing so.
And on the culture front, protests stopped the Commodores from playing Sun City. While Lorraine Pawson, a South African star, visits New York. All of these stories and more this week on South Africa Now with Fana, Kekana and Carolyn Craven.
Shade. Peace in Angola. After 14 years of war in a conflict known for South African intervention, CIA involvement, and Cuban troops, the government of Angola and their longtime nemesis Jonas Savimbi have negotiated a ceasefire that may lead to the inclusion of UNITA in the Angolan government.
The MPLA government and UNITA's Jonas Savimbi, two longtime enemies, met for negotiations in neighboring Zaire on June 22nd under the auspices of that country's President Mobutu and with the involvement of the leaders of a number of African states. They came away with plans for a ceasefire.
The heads of state at this summit, through our chairman of the OAU, now convey a message of hope for Angola, for peace, eternal peace, and unity and development.
In New York, Omorou Yousoufou of the Organization of African Unity called the truce a victory for Africa.
There is nothing international about the problem in Angola. It's a purely African problem, and it's a purely Angolan internal affairs. And only their African brothers and sisters could understand and could help them. And this is what happened in Zaire.
The State Department saw the agreement as a vindication of America's pro-Savimbi policy.
We have always had the objective of what we call national reconciliation, which means that UNITA should be recognized as a legitimate political force. I think this has now happened. Savimbi has appeared before 15 chiefs of state. They've recognized him, and that true bargaining is now going to start. That's all we ever asked for.
But in an exclusive interview with South Africa Now, Herman Cohen, the new Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, said he is not ready to recommend an end to covert CIA support for UNITA.
We will not make any changes in our policy till we really see a process of negotiation really getting going. At that point, we will consult with Dr. Savimbi and see what we should be doing. We look forward to the day when U.S. assistance will no longer be necessary, but it's a little premature right now to make such decisions.
Obviously, that will complicate things, because the more external interference we get, the more difficult it's going to be for us to negotiate.
We will have more of our interview with Ambassador Herman Cohen immediately following the news, including the prospects for peace talks in Mozambique, where the government has indicated a willingness to negotiate with Renamo rebels. But first, Stuart Sender has more on Angola and the history of a gruesome and protracted war that may have finally come to an end.
The war in Angola has been long and bloody, and its conclusion would be a decisive step toward peace in the region. It has had a devastating impact on the country, costing more than 100,000 lives, with landmines turning Angola into the amputation capital of the world. The war started back in 1975, just as the Portuguese colonialists withdrew, paving the way for independence. There were three movements then. One, the FNLA, led by the brother-in-law of Zaire's President Mobutu and backed by the CIA. The second was UNITA, led by Jonas Savimbi, whose checkered history was called into question by historian William Minter.
The most extraordinary con man of African politics, someone who has portrayed himself as a freedom fighter when he was actually working with the Portuguese military during the period that Angolans were trying to get independence from Portugal, someone who then shifted to being supported by South Africa and the United States, who basically is extremely good at telling people what they want to hear.
In fact, Savimbi was a staunch supporter of Mao in the 1960s and received backing from the Chinese leader as well. By the 1980s, he had become the darling of the anti-communist right and Ronald Reagan's favorite freedom fighter.
So tonight, each of us joins in saluting the heroes of the Lamba River and their leader, the hope of Angola, Jonas Savimbi.
We want to have peace in our country, and also we want to form a government national unity with the MPLA, so that we go back to the Alvor Agreement, which called for elections in our country. And we did not have that chance to elect the government because the Cubans have invaded our country in 1975.
It was the MPLA, the third major political grouping, that was widely recognized as the most popular non-tribally based movement. As it consolidated its government, South Africa invaded with the tacit encouragement of then Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Enter the Cubans, invited by the MPLA to help stop Pretoria's advance. Without their aid, the South Africans would have prevailed. The invasion was stopped, but South Africa and the United States continued to pump support into Savimbi's army. In 1986, the war reached a decisive point, with the South Africans launching an offensive to support UNITA. In response, the Cubans and Angolans counterattacked. A key battle in the Angolan river town of Cuito Cuanavale forced the South Africans to back down.
When you meet a white South African,
con un racista,
a racist,
lo único que tienen que
the
preguntar
only thing you have to ask him
¿qué
is,
pasó en Cuito Cuanavale?
what happened in Cuito Cuanavale?
¿Qué pasó en
What
Cuito
happened in
Cuanavale?
Cuito Cuanavale?
It was the outcome of that battle which led to the peace agreement between Angola, Cuba, and South Africa. With the Cubans withdrawing and Namibia becoming independent, the Angolan government became more receptive to negotiations.
We are ready to receive all those from UNITA that will renounce violence.
With African states pressing Angola to end the war, a deal was struck.
The two leaders were sat down and were told that the suffering had to stop. There are innocent people who are dying. Angola is a very wealthy country, and there is no reason for that country to have the largest number of amputees in the world. There is no reason for that country to have the largest number of orphans, not only in the continent of Africa, but in the world.
Still unresolved is exactly what role UNITA will play in Angola's government. In the weeks ahead, we will continue to report on the peace process now underway inside Angola. This is Stuart Sender for South Africa Now.
The executions of Chinese protesters has outraged the world. But South Africa is planning to send more of its dissidents to the gallows too. A court has sentenced 14 of the so-called Uppington 26 to hang after being convicted in a trial that has provoked international condemnation. Leti Masemula reports.
This is the remote town of Uppington, located in the north of South Africa, not far from the Namibian border. It was here in 1985, during a period of civil unrest, that an angry crowd, protesting increased rents, killed a black policeman who had just shot and wounded a young child. Now 25 have been convicted of the policeman's murder. 14 are sentenced to hang. In the neighboring town of Pabalelo, protesters condemned the court's decision.
We are in the midst of a campaign internationally where the apartheid regime and its international backers are trying to derail our disinvestment campaigns, saying that they are reforming for the better. We are saying if reform is the hanging of the Uppington 14, let there be more disinvestment. We are opposed to that type of reform.
Only one of the Uppington 26, as the defendants have come to be known, was accused of delivering the blows that killed the policeman. But the others were convicted on the grounds that they shared a common purpose. Attorney Richard Dicker explains the common purpose doctrine.
The common purpose doctrine is a traditional theory of criminal law whereby the court will allocate an equal degree of responsibility to the perpetrators of a crime where killing results. The classic example being a bank robbery where individuals get together to hold up a bank at gunpoint. In the Uppington case, 10 of the 14 defendants who have been sentenced to die were not alleged or found to have been on the scene where the killing took place. It sends a message that participation in a political demonstration where a killing results is a potentially capital offense.
An attorney in the Uppington trial told South Africa Now the convictions are being appealed. According to Amnesty International, South Africa's execution rate between 1985 and 1988 was surpassed only by Iran and Iraq. Of the 117 people hanged in South Africa last year, only 3 were white. There are no black judges in South Africa.
This is Joseph Disho with Namibia Watch. In many cities around the world, Namibians who were forced into exile are preparing to return home, some more than 30 years after fleeing South African occupation of their country. But as the refugees return to Namibia, there is fear for their safety and continuing reports of intimidation and violence by members of Kufut, the South African-backed paramilitary unit now integrated into the local police. In Angola, the first of more than 2,000 refugees gathered their belongings and ready to leave for Namibia. Among them, key leaders of SWAPO, the Namibian Liberation Movement, seen off by SWAPO Secretary General Yatoivo to prepare for the UN-sponsored elections. But while there was joy as the first planes touched down in Namibia, many exiles refused to leave UN resettlement camps. They fear attacks by Kufut members on SWAPO. We'll have more on this story in coming weeks. This is Joseph Disho with Namibia Watch for South Africa Now.
You're watching South Africa Now, the television news magazine that goes behind the headlines.
Last week, we reported on the crisis in education in South Africa's black townships and intended to present a second report this week. We will show you that report in a later program. Instead, we have an exclusive interview with Herman Cohen, George Bush's new Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. Cohen, who worked for Ronald Reagan's National Security Council, has replaced Chester Crocker, best known for the concept of constructive engagement with South Africa. Cohen says U.S. policy is changing. He talked with South Africa Now to discuss the current thinking inside the United States government.
We began with the breaking news of the ceasefire in Angola. Assistant Secretary Cohen stressed that there are difficult negotiations still ahead.
I would not say that what happened in Zaire is the ultimate solution. There's a lot of hard bargaining still remaining as to how they're going to integrate UNITA and the government, what role Savimbi will play, and how they will finally have a new constitutional order. That's going to be a long road. But I think the beginning here is really excellent news.
Mozambique. The State Department now favors Angolan-style negotiations between the Mozambican government and the South African-supported Renamo insurgents. The State Department estimates that more than 100,000 have been killed in the conflict.
We are urging negotiations. We fully recognize that Renamo was created by the white Rhodesians and then further created by the South African intelligence forces. There's no question about that. Even the South Africans admit that. However, at this point, Renamo is essentially an organization, a military organization that exists on its own, and we see no other way to bring about peace in that country than through a negotiated settlement. After all, Renamo, despite all their atrocities and human rights violations, they are still Mozambicans, and there should be a negotiated settlement. And President Mugabe of Zimbabwe now agrees with this, and I think President Chissano himself agrees with this. So to the extent that we can promote a negotiation, I think we should do that.
We then moved on to South Africa. Cohen revealed that the U.S. is working with Margaret Thatcher to broker negotiations.
We're consulting actively with the British. We have had consultations in Washington within recent days, and it seems to me they're ready to play a more activist role in trying to bring about a negotiation, and for the same reason we are. They see new faces coming on the scene, and they feel that now's the time to hit them and get some movement.
U.S. incentives for change. We asked him about reports that the Bush administration is shaping a new policy aimed at providing a quid pro quo with South Africa.
If South Africa does certain things like release Mandela, Sisulu, and Mbeki, if they lift the state of emergency, for example, then the President of the United States has the power to waive sanctions. In fact, when we talked to the Senate Democrats, when I accompanied Secretary Baker to discuss this in his consultative process, Senator Simon and Senator Kennedy both said, we will approve your waiving certain sanctions if the South Africans do the right thing. So start thinking about, for example, allowing South African Airways to land in New York again. So everybody agrees with that concept. You must have carrots as well as sticks.
Sanctions against South Africa. It's been reported that President Bush is against them.
What we're opposing now are more sanctions. One thing President Bush has made clear in his discussions with African leaders, and most recently with President Kaunda, he has said, we do not want to repeal sanctions. I think this is a significant position of President Bush, because he understands that pressure must be maintained. What he opposes, and what the whole bureaucracy is asking him to oppose, is more sanctions, because you're getting to the point now where more sanctions must start hurting the frontline states. Because what is the one sanction the United States has left to apply that's really meaningful? And that's a total cutoff of trade with South Africa. It means no imports and no exports. Well, if no imports are allowed to South Africa, a lot of imports are going to be cut off for Zambia and Zimbabwe and Botswana. And I don't think the U.S. Congress is ready to put up $1 billion a year to start flying things into those countries.
Prospects for change. As South Africa talks more about reforming apartheid, we asked if the State Department takes this talk seriously.
I'm fairly optimistic. As I said, there's not going to be a magic bullet that's going to take care of apartheid in a short period. It's going to be an evolutionary process. But the main thing is, do we see a light at the end of the tunnel? Do we see a time frame in which an end game will be possible so that there will be a political solution? What makes me happy, or not happy, but optimistic, is I think finally the white community has realized that its own future, its own standard of living, depends on a political settlement. In other words, they have acknowledged that their own future is in the hands of the blacks. I think this is a major psychological breakthrough in South Africa, and that's what's going to give us progress.
Finally, we discussed developments in Namibia.
I believe that the independence process is on track, and I think Namibia will reach independence on April 1st, 1990. It's going to be a rocky road due to the great distrust between SWAPO and the South Africans, which has developed over the years. It's natural. There's been such hatred. I don't think it's going to go smoothly. I have full confidence in the UN operation down there. I think there's some very good professionals. Marty Adesari, the Secretary General Special Representative, is a very competent manager, and I think it'll go all right. Because I have such confidence in him, I am now starting to get worried because he is now complaining about South African paramilitary people, especially the old Kufut, engaging in intimidation of civilians in Ovambo land. And if he says it, I'm really worried. So we will be talking to the South African government starting within the next few days to tell them we really think they ought to be careful and stop doing what they're being accused of doing.
We showed Cohen these pictures, broadcast by South Africa Now, that indicate these SWAPO troops may have been killed execution style by South African forces.
I'm unable to confirm these claims, but I understand there is a commission which is investigating it, and I'd like to wait the results of it. If it is as you described it, if people were shot in the back of the head after they were captured, obviously this would be a major human rights violation, but I'd like to wait until we see the results of the investigation.
In the weeks ahead, we will feature other perspectives on the conflict in southern Africa. This is Jay Weiss reporting.
You're watching South Africa Now. Coming up next, our culture segment, featuring the best music, film, drama, and artistic expression from Southern Africa.
In our culture segment this week, some news and music. First, from South Africa, a report that Richard Reeve, a well-known anti-apartheid playwright, was murdered just days before the opening of his new play about forced removals of black communities in the Cape region. Masisi Kunene, a South African poet teaching at the University of California at Los Angeles, was shocked by the news of the violent death of his friend.
My reaction is one of disgust. Disgust at the amount of senseless killing, senseless violence that is taking place. That doesn't seem to spare even butterflies. We, a society, in order to be itself, beyond its own physical everyday reality, must have butterflies, and butterflies symbolize the richness of life and the variety of life in a society.
Our second cultural report is about the Commodores, once a popular singing group. They announced plans to break the cultural boycott of South Africa by performing at Sun City, the now infamous resort in the Bophuthatswana homeland. The group said they were assured they could speak out against apartheid. Their appearance was opposed by SAMA, the South African Musicians Alliance, which held a press conference to protest.
We find it disturbing that when there is so much happening in the world, and in terms of solidarity action, and South Africa being isolated and trying its best to try to gain acceptance to the world from sports to cultural activities. Once more, we still have these Palukas from overseas coming to our country from time to time and uttering remarks and statements in solidarity with us without consultation. We find it unacceptable based on a principle that we are not going to allow such sharks, mostly from America from time to time, coming to our country and become cultural boycott busters.
Rick Dutka of Artists United Against Apartheid.
We at Artists United Against Apartheid were very relieved that the Commodores decided not to play South Africa. We felt that they stood the chance of being used as pawns in a boycott-breaking strategy, despite their best intentions. And we were proud that they took it upon themselves to recognize the seriousness of the decision and to renounce the engagement.
Meanwhile, this popular singer from South Africa, Lorraine Klassen, is now touring in the US. She recently played a date at New York's SOB Club. Our camera was there.
I just recently recorded an album, you know. I'm very broad. And right now, like I said, I'm in a free country, so I'm experimenting different things, you know, but without never forgetting to make sure that you leave room for seriousness, just a little bit. You know, you try to make a point out of the whole evening.
Last week, we inadvertently erred in reporting that only black students have to pay school and uniform fees. While white schools do receive healthier government subsidies, they are not exempt from fees. Thanks to the viewer who called that error to our attention, we would be very interested in your comments and reactions as well.
Thank you for watching South Africa Now. Beginning in August, the program will be available to public television stations across the country. If you like what we are doing, please ask your friends in other parts of the country to request the show from their local station. For a free resource list on the issues we cover or to purchase a transcript of this program, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to South Africa Now, the Africa Fund, 198 Broadway, New York, New York, 10038. Transcripts are $3. Ask for show 308. South Africa Now is produced by Global Vision on a non-profit basis in association with the Africa Fund.